Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the program. I'm Angela Courte MacKenzie, your host, and I'm delighted that you're with us today. We're going to be talking with Dr. James Orr, who's joining us from Cambridge, England, in just a couple of minutes, talking about the intersection between faith and reason, talking about what's the place of Christians and academics, and just kind of touching on some different topics that are hitting the bell that I've been hearing from some of you, things you're interested in talking about. So I've invited Dr. Orr to be with us, and he's graciously joining us from Cambridge. He has a little break in his schedule, and he's here to talk with us about some of these different subjects. I am saying hello from my home in Scotland. Welcome, everybody, to Scotland. This is an international program today. I'm in Scotland, he's in England, and my crew is in Orlando. Matter of fact, the crew at the SuperChannel, do you have a second just to say hi to everybody? There they are. Hello, Rick. Hello, Angie. Hello, Nathan. Three amazing people who help us bring the program together. And I just want to give a shout out to the whole crew. Living here in Scotland, even though I'm a Florida native, has been a lovely adventure for me. I've gotten to really know the area, love the people, and I'm loving some of the just nature of Scotland and the beautiful animals. Let me share with you a picture of a new foal that was just born a week or so ago. This is of my neighbor who lives about a mile down the street, and she raises horses, and she said, Angela, I've got something I want you to share on your program. So please meet the new little foal named Ollie. There he is running with his mother. And she said he was born ready to run. So just gorgeous, part of God's beautiful handiwork. And you can see him running right in step with his mom, and just such a beautiful colt. Now, his father is a black stallion, so that's where he gets his black mane. And he's just beautiful, but he loves his mom. There he is, enjoying the hay. He's kind of spirited and ready for a good run. But I just wanted to give you a little update on some beautiful things happening this spring here in Scotland. And if you join me on any of the other programs, I give other updates. I've got chickens, I've got ducks, I've got a cat who's actually right over there. She's found a spot on the blanket and she's sleeping. But just want to share with you of my life, what's happening, and also kind of come along as a companion in your walk of faith, to be a friend with you and to bring friends and guests on the program as we are walking this journey of faith together, to discuss, to question, to receive encouragement and daily food. Lord Jesus prayed, give us this day our daily bread. And I pray that this program is part of that blessing for you, that you'll actually, when this program's over, that you'll leave going, gosh, I feel like I've really just learned something I didn't know before. I've explored an idea. I've heard from God. And that's what this is about. And God moves through his people. He's given us his word, and he's given us his presence. He's given us his spirit. So today, I'm glad that you're with me. If you're watching on SuperChannel, hello to all my friends there in Central Florida. And if you're watching on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, be sure and like the page. Be sure and hit the little bell, ding, so you'll be notified when we have new programs. Well, moving to our guest, I'm honored and delighted to have Dr. James Orr. He is formerly a fellow at the MacDonald Center at the University of Oxford, and he's currently the assistant professor in philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England. He's here to talk about the intersection of faith and reason and some other interesting things. So please welcome to the program, Dr. Orr.
It's lovely to be with you, Angela.
Welcome, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. I know your schedule's very busy right now. Thanks for taking the time to drop in. Dr. Orr, you are in Cambridge, England, and at a university, of course, called Cambridge, which I believe is a few hundred years old, began in 1209. What's the beginning of this well thought of and this ancient institution?
Well, legend has it, and I think it's a little bit more than legend. I think there's a strong historical kernel to it all, that some fights broke out between members of the university and members of the town in the University of Oxford right at the beginning of the 13th century. There's a so-called conflict between town and gown. And I think it led to one or two homicides, and those who were thought to be responsible escaped and sought asylum with the Bishop of Ely, who's based up in Ely Cathedral, which is a little bit further up the river. And being a fine Christian man, he granted their request, but being a very intelligent diplomat, he said, "You're not going to have asylum here. There's a little market town a bit further down the River Cam, another town named after a bridge crossing a ford crossing a river, Cambridge, Canterbridge." And so that's where they settled. As you say, about 1209, I think the first settlement was Peterhouse, which is still one of the oldest constituent college in the University of Cambridge. So it's like Oxford. It's a medieval university. So it's made up of independent colleges, which are, as it were, federated together.
Right, and you are there as an assistant professor in the philosophy of religion. Now, for folks who that sounds just like a lot of big words, would you take a moment to share with us kind of what is philosophy, and then what is the philosophy of religion?
Well, philosophy in the purest sense is the love of wisdom. It's the love of pursuing truth. That's where we get the word from the Greeks, so philein, to love, and sophia, wisdom. So that's really all that philosophy is. And I think it's one of those areas that I think puzzles people, partly because it just is so simple. It's asking very, very simple questions. But as I think you'll probably agree, and your viewers will agree, it's often the simplest questions that are the hardest to answer. Who am I? What are human beings? Does God exist? Is the world real, or is it just sort of made up by some, are we brains in a vat, for example? You get all these very strange thought experiments in philosophy, but really what it boils down to is the love of and the pursuit of truth and wonder. Amazement at the sheer fact that we exist at all. Now, you can look at that question from different angles. You can look at it from a Christian point of view. You can look at it from a non-Christian point of view, and each, as it were, has its own validity and its own interest. But really, the horizon of wisdom and truth is what philosophers aspire to, or at least what they ought to aspire to.
So the philosophy of religion could be described as?
Really looking at philosophical questions about the meaning of those topics and themes that religion gives rise to. Now, religion is a notoriously difficult word and concept to pin down. It hasn't always meant what we think it means these days. In fact, as a word in its current use, it's only about 200 or 300 years old, which is actually not that old, not as old as philosophy is as a term. But roughly speaking, it's looking at questions like, could I give a reason for why I believe in God? Could I give a reason for why I think that human beings, though infinitely precious, are also susceptible to sin? Can I make sense of claims involving how it is that I get rescued from this state of sin? So that would be, as it were, thinking in a kind of rational, reason-based way about religious truths, religious beliefs, in a way that somebody who is not religious could at least begin to get a grip of, even if that person didn't accept the claims.
Even for those of us, I would say, who have accepted the claims, these are questions that we all we all need to most times work through. I can tell you, Dr. Orr, just a little bit of my story, and then I would love to know some of your story. I was raised in a home, where we were taken to church, came to Christ at a very young age, always loved Jesus, president of the youth group, doing music in church, just loved the Lord. But when I was a freshman at university, I got kind of cornered in some conversations that I had never really been challenged. I had been encouraged in the faith, but not ever really challenged on why I believe. And as a young person, I can tell you it brought a shifting of the sands, so to speak, under my belief system. And in the goodness of God, as the more I've studied and asked questions and searched for truth, it's strengthened my faith. It's done the opposite of what some folks say. If you really question, you'll walk away from faith. For me, the more I've questioned with an open heart, with childlike faith, it's actually anchored me even more in the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You're in the academic world, if not the top institution, let's just be honest, Cambridge is just in a league, par none almost to any other, maybe forgot. I mean, my husband would say Aberdeen was the first university in the UK, but Oxford, Cambridge, these wonderful institutions. Christians sometimes are a little bit leery of pursuing an academic course because they're like, well, is it going to undermine my faith? How would you talk or encourage folks about the intersection that seems to truly exist between faith and reason?
Well, you're absolutely right, Angela. A lot of people are put off, and partly because faith and reason, the pairing that you just introduced into our conversation, is often seen as a pairing that is really a pairing of opposites, rather than a pairing of two ways of thinking about the world that are in harmony. And so a lot of people just think that the opposite of faith is reason, and the opposite of reason is faith, that these two just simply can't go together. But that's simply not the case. Augustine and Anselm, all these great figures in the history of the church, understood that actually all reasoning requires a sort of leap of faith, you might say. A good example of this would be scientific truths. Now, if I gave you a school textbook of a physics textbook from let's say 100 years ago, the very best that was taught and thought about the natural world 100 years ago, I think you would smile at some of the things that it gets wrong. And I would too, even though probably neither of us are real experts in the natural sciences. And the reason for that is that our knowledge of the natural world is developing the whole time. Now, of course, it makes sense to say, look, you've got to think about these scientific claims as the most rational claims there are. This is the benchmark of what reasoning is. This is the best, this is the truthiest truth we can get our hands on. But of course, even that requires, as it were, in the back of our minds, a sort of knowledge that this is a kind of faith, in the sense that we know that the truths are going to be so heavily revised when we fast forward 100 years, that really there will come a point when we don't see these as rational truths to hold. So faith and reason do go together. A lot of the deepest commitments and intuitions we have about the world, loving relationships, the trust that we might have in another human being, these are not the kinds of commitments and beliefs that involve reason. In fact, it would often be completely inappropriate to think in a purely rational or rationalistic, reason-based way about a loving relationship that one has with a person. The question, it's a question, as it were, of taking a risk and acting as if we don't have a 100% certainty about the world and the world that we're trying to navigate. There are actually very few things that we have complete certainty about. We might say that we have complete certainty about mathematical truths. Now, some people might find mathematics lots of fun, but it It's not going to answer questions about meaning. It's not going to answer questions about morality. It's not going to answer questions about our intuitions about beauty, about music, about great literature. All of those avenues of human inquiry are ways of thinking about the world that just can't just be reason-based and can't just end in completely certain claims about the world.
Yes, we as humans, we love reasons. We affirm from the youngest age that 2 + 2 is 4. It's a non-negotiable truth. And yet we also live with longings, live with hope, we live with, desires, and those are not things you can find in a test tube, are they?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I think one of the problems 250 years, there have been such extraordinary developments that we must all count ourselves so thankful for and so fortunate to have experienced, as it were. And that's, I think, led to a sense that science, as it were, has displaced religion as the best benchmark we have of what's really real. Hmm. And I think that what's happened is that one particular area of human inquiry, the natural sciences, has become so successful that it started to colonize other areas of human inquiry. And the thought is that just as theology used to be the foundational layer of human knowledge, now it's the natural sciences. But what that's doing is it's pushing the sciences into areas that it was never meant to really be able to be able to deal with. As I said, those questions about meaning and morality and our minds, or to use the old-fashioned word, the soul. These are all questions that and areas that can't be settled with a microscope and a test tube.
So tell us, if you don't mind, take us back. Tell me a little bit of your journey to faith. As an academic, a man of reason and learning, where did faith come in as something you realized, it's just not enough just to have this certain kind of knowledge. There's this knowledge of God that is speaking to me.
Well, I didn't really grow up in a confessional context. My family were not particularly atheistic, but they weren't regular churchgoers, put it that way. But I had the good fortune of being sent to boarding school at a very young age. And boarding school gives you that very kind of traditional sort of English boarding schools. And they, as it were, took Christianity very, very seriously. You had daily chapel almost every day for the best part of 10 years. And so although I wasn't really particularly engaged with it, it was just part of the furniture of life. It was part of the rhythms of life. And so, I started to absorb, without really thinking about it, some of the great hymns of the Anglican Church, and some of the sort of great cadences and intonation of the King James Bible. It was always very sort of traditional form of Christianity. And so I suppose it got into my spiritual arteries. That Christianity got into my spiritual arteries without me ever really thinking about the question of whether or not I was a believer or a theist or a confessing Christian. It wasn't actually until I think my mid-20s, when I was about 23, 24, that I would say I underwent, if not a conversion experience, certainly a very intense renewal of interest and commitment in the Christian faith. And there are a number of sort of reasons, that sort of factors that led to that. I'll just give you a couple. I mean, one of them was that I had the good fortune of studying the classics at university. So Latin and Greek and ancient history and ancient philosophy and all of these areas that require great teachers and great institutions, as it were, injecting you with all this difficult stuff. And what that did is it made me very comfortable with the ancient world. very interested in the ancient world. I would read books about the ancient world well beyond university. And so when I started to kind of think about Christianity as a set of historical claims about the way in which God acts in history, it was a period of history that I was already very familiar with and as it were, loved, at least in the context of Greece and Rome. And so I loved, as it were, grafting onto that the world of Second Temple Judaism, as it were, of early Palestinian Christianity, and looking at the Gospels in particular just as historical documents, in roughly the way that I would look at the Greek and Roman historians in quite a kind of objective sort of way. Are they telling the truth? Have they got biases? Can we confirm whether or not they're telling the truth from other sources or from archaeological evidence and so on and so forth? So that was an important condition, I think, an important factor in helping me to sort of turbocharging my inquiry into whether or not the claims of Christianity were true.
Wonderful. My guest today is Dr. James Orr. He's assistant professor of philosophy and religion at the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England. And Dr. Orr, if you don't mind, we're going to turn on the firing round. I've got a series of questions. I'd love some answers, and let's get through as many of these questions as we can. We have about 7 minutes left. And folks, if you're watching, you are free to also leave a question, and we'll do our best to respond to them and to get some answers, but there are answers there. What is a human being?
Well, I would say that a human being is, the most important thing about a human being is that human beings are persons with an irreducible dignity and rationality and an irreducible worth.
Okay. What are ethics in today's age?
Well, if ethics are anything in today's age, they are ethics for all ages. So my view is that if anything is an ethical truth, it's an ethical truth for all ages and not just this age. And if it's an ethical truth that's an ethical truth just for this age, it's not an ethical truth.
Okay. Speaking of truth, we are being barraged now with terms like this is my truth, this is their truth, find your truth. What is truth?
Well, God is truth. And by that, I mean that God is the source of all truths. That is to say, if God creates all of reality distinct from himself out of nothing, there are, as it were, no truths that exist that float free of God's creative agency. If we park God, however, and have a purely non-religious or secular understanding of what truth is, well, a true statement is a true statement if and only if it corresponds to the reality it's describing. That would be a classic view. That would be the so-called correspondence theory of truth.
Right.
So the truth that snow is white is true if and only if there's some snow that's white.
Yes. Okay. How would you encourage Christians who are pursuing, postdoctorate degrees, or they're in academics, they feel like they're in a very pressurized environment, they don't sense a great deal of support for their Christian faith in their work? What's your advice for them?
Well, I would say to persevere and to trust in God, trust in one's church, trust in one's community, and to always have, as it were, a life in community, in Christian community, that will support you, will provide the kind of scaffolding that you need in the secular workplace. Actually, whether that's the difficult life of being a graduate student or an ordinary workplace. But I think there is something, graduate life and doing difficult research is always quite a lonely enterprise. And people are always kind of craving community. And that's what I think the Christian churches can do very well. Certainly that's the case here in Cambridge. So I think that would be the answer: community and the practices of faith and trust in God.
Out of all of the world religions, why Christianity?
Well, the short answer to that is because it's true. The longer answer might take longer than we've got, but I would just simply say one of the ways of thinking about it would be, look, there are some claims that some religions that claim to be true because of certain historical claims that are made. And then there are some religions that claim to be true because they say that they're making truths, they're stating truths just about the way ultimate reality is. And roughly speaking, those two ways of thinking about religion map onto, on the one hand, the Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and broadly speaking, the Eastern religions on the other. That's a little bit simplistic, but it will do. So one answer is to say that it's credible, it's likely to, it is more probable than not that God exists. It is reasonable to expect that such a God would want to leave his authenticating signature on history in some very dramatic and public way. That would narrow things down perhaps to the historical traditions. And then it would be a case of, as it were, assessing the historical evidence for the three main historical religions. There, of course, are others, but looking at the historicity of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And I would have, my own view is that Christianity scores much, much higher on those historicity tests than the other two.
Yes. Plus, if I could just humbly add, I believe that the life of Christ is there's no one that's been like Christ. You can look at the founder of Islam, search his life and things, and then look at the life of Christ. And even as great as Abraham was, you know, he had his own faults. But in Christ, there was no fault, there was no sin. He came to actually give his life, not just to give a message, but he came to give his life. And I believe with you that that's why Christianity above all other religions. Dr. Orr's been joining us today from Cambridge, England. Thank you, sir, so much. We have about a minute left. Any final words for those who are watching?
Well, it's been a great privilege to be part of this program and a special privilege to be beamed into the United States and to be watched by our beloved American cousins. And and I think a lot of your viewers will be in Florida, but also well beyond that. And so no, just it's been a great pleasure, and I give great thanks to our American cousins for all of the work they do, not only as it were in the church, but also particularly in my discipline, philosophy of religion. If it were not for some of the great universities in the United States, and if it were not for, I can think of 2 or 3 dozen wonderful scholars over there who have certainly enriched my intellectual life and enriched my understanding of some of the deepest questions one can ask about God and religion and reality. So it's wonderful, as it were, to be beamed into a country that has produced people who've meant so much to me over the years.
Amen. Well, thank you for joining us. And all my dear friends who have been watching, thank you. Listen, continue to ask questions. Search. Jesus he's on the way and the truth and life. And the scripture says, if you search for me, you will find me. And you search for me with your whole heart. God is truth. We thank you for your time. We love you and wish you a wonderful day. And we'll see you next time.